In the dusty streets of Millbrook, a woman who once shaped young minds now walks invisible among the very people she taught their children to read. Margaret Sullivan had been the town's most respected schoolteacher for 15 years until the school board decided they could no longer afford her services. With no family and nowhere to turn, she found herself hungry and homeless, watching former friends cross the street to avoid her pleading eyes. The townspeople who once brought her apple pies and praised her dedication now treated her like a shadow from their past. But one man refused to look away. Morrison, a weathered cowboy struggling to keep his own ranch afloat, saw something in Margaret that everyone else had forgotten: her dignity, her worth, her humanity. What happened next would challenge everything this small town believed about charity, compassion, and second chances. But would one act of kindness be enough to heal two broken souls and awaken a community's conscience? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boardwalks of Millbrook, painting the frontier town in hues of amber and gold that masked its slow decay. Once a thriving hub where cattle drives converged and dreams took root, the settlement now bore the weary look of a place that had seen better days. Paint peeled from storefront signs, and more than a few buildings stood empty, their windows like hollow eyes staring at a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. Margaret Sullivan's modest cottage had once been the heart of learning in this community. For 15 years, children had climbed the worn steps to her front door, clutching slate boards and pencils, their faces bright with the anticipation that only knowledge could bring. The hand-carved wooden desk that dominated her front room had witnessed countless lessons, patient corrections, and moments of breakthrough when struggling students finally grasped a difficult concept. That desk, crafted by her late father with loving precision, had been more than furniture. It was the throne from which she had ruled her gentle kingdom of education. But that was before the politics came calling, before Mayor Caldwell and his cronies on the school board decided that education was a luxury Millbrook could no longer afford. Before they told her that her services were no longer required, that the children could make do with occasional visits from a traveling teacher who charged half her salary and provided a quarter of her dedication. The desk now sat in Henderson's storage shed, gathering dust and mouse droppings, awaiting an owner who could no longer afford the storage fees. Margaret had been forced to watch as her life's work was reduced to a pile of belongings she couldn't afford to keep. Her books, her carefully prepared lesson plans, her collection of children's artwork, all of it had been swept away like autumn, leaves before an uncaring wind. 3 miles outside town, Morrison tended to his modest spread with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that hard work was the only reliable companion in an uncertain world. His ranch, if it could be called that, consisted of 40 acres of stubborn prairie grass, a weathered barn that leaked in 3 places, and a small house that had once rung with laughter, but now echoed with the hollow silence of loss. The house still bore traces of Sarah's presence, though she had been gone for 8 months now. Her quilt still covered the bed they had shared for 12 years. Her coffee cup sat in its customary place on the kitchen shelf. Her garden, though wild and overgrown, still bloomed with the flowers she had planted in defiance of the harsh frontier climate. Jake couldn't bring himself to change these things, couldn't bear to acknowledge that the woman who had made this house a home was never coming back. Sarah Morrison had been Millbrook's unofficial angel of mercy, the woman who appeared at bedsides during illness, who brought food to grieving families, who somehow always knew when someone needed a kind word or helping hand. She had died as she had lived, thinking of others. Even as the fever consumed her, she had whispered instructions to Jake about which neighbors needed checking on, which elderly folks required assistance with their chores. The irony wasn't lost on him that his wife, who had spent her life caring, For others, had been taken by an illness that could have been treated if Millbrook had possessed a proper doctor instead of old Doc Patterson, whose medical knowledge came more from experience than formal training. But Jake tried not to dwell on such bitter thoughts. Sarah wouldn't have wanted that. His daily routine had become a ritual of survival. Up before dawn to tend the handful of cattle that represented his livelihood, mending fences that seemed determined to fall down faster than he could repair them, checking on the horses that served as his connection to the world beyond his property. And every evening, without fail, the walk to the small cemetery on the hill where Sarah rested, beneath a simple wooden cross he had carved with his own hands. It was during one of his trips to town for supplies that Jake first noticed Margaret Sullivan's decline. She had always been a fixture at Henderson's general store, discussing her students' progress with their parents, selecting books and supplies with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of education. But over the past months, her visits had become different. She moved through the store like a ghost, counting coins carefully, putting back items she couldn't afford, avoiding eye contact with people who had once greeted her warmly. The townspeople's treatment of their former teacher mystified and angered Jake. These were the same folks who had praised Margaret's dedication at every town meeting, who had boasted about their children's achievements under her tutelage, who had proclaimed her a treasure to the community. Yet now they crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her, whispered behind their hands when she passed, and treated her financial struggles as somehow shameful rather than tragic. Mayor Caldwell, a portly man with political ambitions that far, exceeded the boundaries of Millbrook, had led the charge to eliminate Margaret's position. He spoke eloquently about fiscal responsibility and the need to prioritize essential services, but Jake noticed that the mayor's own salary had remained untouched. The school board, composed of men who had never spent a day in a classroom, had nodded along with Caldwell's pronouncements, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they were dismantling the very foundation of their community's future. Doc Patterson, weathered and wise despite his informal medical training, had tried to speak in Margaret's defense. He understood better than most the value of education, having seen too many young people leave Millbrook because they lacked the skills to build meaningful lives. But his voice had been drowned out by concerns about budgets and taxes, by the short-sighted thinking that viewed education as an expense rather than an investment. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store with her husband, had once been Margaret's friend. They had shared tea and gossip, discussed books and recipes, planned community events together. But when Margaret's circumstances changed, so did Mrs. Henderson's loyalty. Perhaps it was fear that association with the fallen teacher might damage her standing in the community. Perhaps it was simple cowardice. Whatever the reason, she now treated Margaret with cool politeness at best, and often pretended not to see her at all. The abandoned schoolhouse, where Margaret now sheltered, told its own story of dreams deferred. Built with community pride and optimism, it had been a symbol of Millbrook's commitment to the future. Now its windows were boarded up, its bells silent, its classrooms empty, save for the mice and spiders that had claimed dominion over spaces once filled with young voices, reciting lessons and sharing discoveries. Margaret had been forced to move into the schoolhouse when she could no longer afford rent on her cottage. The building offered minimal comfort, no running water, limited protection from the elements, and the constant reminder of everything she had lost. But it was shelter, and in her current circumstances, that was more than many could claim. Jake often found himself riding past the schoolhouse during his evening journeys, telling himself he was simply taking a different route home. But in truth, he was checking on her, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was Sarah's influence, even in death. She had always noticed people others overlooked, had always found ways to help without making the recipient feel diminished. Or perhaps it was his own sense of justice, offended by the sight of a good woman being punished for circumstances beyond her control. He had seen Margaret emerge from the schoolhouse on mornings when frost covered the ground, her breath visible in the cold air, her thin shawl inadequate protection against the prairie wind. He had watched her walk to the town well for water, carrying buckets that seemed too heavy for her diminished frame. He had observed her gathering kindling for fires that provided more hope than warmth in the drafty building that had become her reluctant home. The transformation in Margaret herself was heartbreaking to witness. The confident educator who had once commanded respect and attention had been replaced by a woman who seemed to be slowly disappearing. Her clothes, once neat and professional, now hung loose on a frame that spoke of too many missed meals. Her hair, always perfectly arranged for her teaching duties, now showed the effects of stress and inadequate care. But it was her eyes that revealed the deepest change. Where once they had sparkled with enthusiasm for learning and teaching, now they held the dull acceptance of someone who had learned to expect disappointment. Yet, despite her circumstances, Jake noticed that Margaret retained certain qualities that spoke to her fundamental character. She still walked with dignity, despite having every reason to feel defeated. She still spoke kindly to the few people who acknowledged her, showing no bitterness toward those who had abandoned her. She still maintained what standards she could, keeping herself as clean and presentable as circumstances allowed. As winter approached, Jake found his concern for Margaret's welfare growing stronger. The schoolhouse, barely adequate in mild weather, would become a death trap when the prairie winds brought snow and ice. No one else seemed to notice or care about this impending crisis. The town that had once depended on Margaret Sullivan now seemed content to let her fade away like a troublesome memory. But Jake Morrison was not content with such callous indifference. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his ear during those evening rides, reminding him that kindness was never wasted, that dignity was not determined by circumstances, and that sometimes the smallest gestures carried the greatest power to heal. He wasn't sure what he could do to help, but he knew he had to try. The alternative, watching a good woman slowly perish while the community turned away, was unthinkable to a man whose late wife had taught him that compassion was not optional, but essential. The stage was set for an encounter that would change everything, though neither Jake nor Margaret could have anticipated how a simple act of human kindness would ripple outward to transform not just their own lives, but the very soul of a community that had forgotten the meaning of its most important values. The November morning arrived with a bitter wind that cut through even the heaviest coats, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Margaret Sullivan pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down Main Street, each step deliberate, despite the weakness that had been growing stronger with each passing day. She had managed to scrape together enough coins for a small bag of flour and perhaps some dried beans, enough to sustain her for another week if she was careful. The faded photograph tucked inside her worn Bible bore testament to happier times. In it, she stood surrounded by her students from 3 years past, their faces bright with the joy of learning, their small hands proudly displaying the certificates she had made for their completion of the spring term. The photograph had suffered water damage during her forced move to the schoolhouse, the edges curled and the faces slightly blurred, but she treasured it as her last tangible connection to the life she had lost. Henderson's General Store stood at the heart of Millbrook's commercial district, its broad windows displaying goods that spoke of better times, bolts of colorful fabric, gleaming tools, jars of candy that caught the morning light like precious gems. Margaret paused outside, gathering her courage for what had become an ordeal of humiliation. She knew that Mrs. Henderson would treat her with that particular brand of cold politeness reserved for those who had fallen from grace. Knew that other customers would avert their eyes or cease their conversations until she left. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, its cheerful sound incongruous with the tension that immediately filled the space. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her ledger, her expression shifting from neutral efficiency to barely concealed distaste. Two other women shopping near the fabric display, wives of ranchers who had once sought Margaret's advice about their children's education, suddenly found the floor fascinating. "Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Henderson acknowledged with the barest nod of civility. "What can I help you with today?" Margaret approached the counter with what remained of her dignity intact, placing her small collection of coins on the worn wood surface. "I'd like a small bag of flour, please, and if there's enough—" She counted the coins again, her mathematics painfully precise. "Perhaps some beans as well?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes swept over the meager offering with unconcealed disdain. "Flour's gone up in price," she announced, though Margaret was certain it hadn't. "Beans too. Supply problems, you understand." The lie hung in the air between them, as obvious as it was cruel. Margaret felt the familiar heat of shame rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. Perhaps just the flour, then, as Mrs. Henderson made a show of weighing out a portion that seemed smaller than what the coins should have purchased. Margaret became aware of whispered conversations behind her. Words like "shameful" and "should have saved better" and "what" did she expect drifted past her ears like poison arrows. She focused on breathing steadily, on maintaining the appearance of calm, even as her world continued to crumble around her. The transaction complete, Margaret tucked the small bag of flour under her arm and turned toward the door. But as she did, the room began to spin, the edges of her vision darkening like the approach of a storm. She had eaten nothing since yesterday's meager breakfast of weak tea and a crust of bread, and the combination of hunger, stress, and the bitter cold proved too much for her weakened system. Margaret felt herself falling, heard the gasps of surprise from the other customers, felt her precious flour scatter across the floorboards as consciousness slipped away. In that moment of collapse, she saw her reflection in the store's window, a ghost of the confident woman she had once been, brought low by circumstances that seemed to delight in her suffering. The sound of her body hitting the floor brought an immediate hush to the store, followed by a flurry of whispered consultations among the witnesses. Mrs. Henderson emerged from behind the counter, more concerned with the mess than the woman who had made it. "Someone needs to get her out of here," she announced to no one in particular. "This is a place of business, not a charity ward." The other customers murmured agreement, their faces showing more annoyance than concern. Here was the woman who had once taught their children to read and write, who had stayed late countless evenings to help struggling students, who had spent her own meager salary on books and supplies when the school board claimed poverty. Yet they stood around her fallen form like spectators at a mildly interesting roadside accident. It was then that Jake Morrison arrived, drawn by the commotion visible through the store's windows. He had come to town for fence wire and nails, his mind occupied with the endless tasks that kept his ranch functioning. But the sight of Margaret Sullivan unconscious on the floor, surrounded by people who seemed more concerned with inconvenience than compassion, ignited something fierce and protective in his chest. Without hesitation, Jake pushed through the small crowd and knelt beside Margaret, his weathered hands gentle as he checked for signs of injury. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her skin pale and cold to the touch. It was clear to him that this was the collapse of someone pushed beyond their physical limits, someone who had been slowly starving while the community that owed her so much looked the other way. "Someone fetch Doc Patterson," Jake commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. When no one moved immediately, he fixed his steely gaze on young Tommy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's son. "Now, boy, run!" Mrs. Henderson bristled at Jake's presumption to give orders in her establishment. "Really, Mr. Morrison, I don't think it's necessary to involve the doctor. She probably just needs some fresh air and—" "She needs medical attention," Jake interrupted, his tone leaving no room for debate. He carefully lifted Margaret in his arms, surprised by how light she had become, how fragile she felt against his chest. The woman who had once commanded classrooms with quiet confidence now seemed as delicate as a bird with a broken wing. As he carried her toward the door, Jake heard the whispered comments that followed in their wake. "Should mind his own business. Probably just looking for attention. What does a cowboy know about such things? The callousness of it all made his jaw clench with barely controlled anger, but his primary concern was getting Margaret the help she needed. Doc Patterson's office occupied the ground floor of his modest home at the end of Main Street, its waiting room furnished with mismatched chairs and outdated medical texts that spoke of a man doing his best with limited resources. The doctor himself was a study in practical competence, his grey beard neatly trimmed, his hands steady despite their advanced age. Jake placed Margaret gently on the examination table, stepping back to allow Doc Patterson room to work. The doctor's initial assessment was swift and thorough, checking pulse and breathing, examining her eyes and skin tone, his expression growing increasingly grave. "When did she last eat a proper meal?" Doc Patterson asked without looking up from his patient. "I don't rightly know," Jake admitted, "but from the look of her it's been too long." The doctor nodded grimly. "Malnutrition, exhaustion and exposure. She's been slowly starving, and her body finally gave out." He looked up at Jake with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "How did we let it come to this? How did we let one of our own waste away while we went about our comfortable lives?" It was a question that cut to the heart of Jake's own growing anger and shame. Margaret Sullivan had given 15 years of her life to this community, had shaped the minds that would carry Millbrook into the future, had earned the respect and gratitude that should have protected her in times of trouble. Instead, she had been discarded like an unwanted piece of furniture, left to fend for herself in circumstances that would have challenged a strong man, much less a woman alone. As Margaret began to stir, her eyes fluttering open with the confused expression of someone returning from unconsciousness, Jake made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. Whatever it took, whatever the cost to his own reputation or circumstances, he would not stand by and watch Margaret Sullivan fade away. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper approval in his ear, reminding him that kindness was never wasted, that dignity was worth defending, and that sometimes the greatest courage was found in the simplest acts of human decency. "Miss Sullivan, Doctor," Patterson said gently as Margaret's awareness returned. "You've had a spell. You're safe now." Margaret's eyes found Jake's face, confusion giving way to recognition, and then to a deep embarrassment that made her try to sit up too quickly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You haven't caused any trouble," Jake replied firmly, "and you have nothing to apologize for." But even as he spoke those words, Jake knew that the real trouble was just beginning. By involving himself in Margaret's situation, by refusing to walk away when the community had made its position clear, he was challenging the collective conscience of Millbrook. The question now was whether that conscience still existed, or whether it had withered away like so many other vital things in this slowly dying town. The ride to Jake's ranch passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves against the hard-packed earth and the occasional creak of saddle leather. Margaret sat before him, wrapped in his coat, her slight frame trembling from more than just the cold. Doc Patterson had insisted she needed rest, proper food and shelter, luxuries that the abandoned schoolhouse could not provide. When Jake had quietly offered his spare room, Margaret's initial protests had been overruled by both men's gentle but firm insistence. As they approached the modest ranch house, Margaret felt a mixture of gratitude and overwhelming shame. The simple wooden structure, with its covered porch and flower boxes that spoke of a woman's touch, represented a kindness she wasn't sure she deserved. More troubling still was the knowledge that accepting Jake's help would only fuel the gossip that already followed her like a persistent shadow. Jake helped her down from the horse with careful consideration, his hands steady and respectful as he guided her toward the front door. "It's not much," he said, his voice carrying the self-consciousness of a man unaccustomed to entertaining guests. "But it's warm and dry, and that's more than you've had lately." The interior of the house hit Margaret with an unexpected wave of emotion. Everything spoke of the woman who had once made this place a home. The carefully chosen curtains, the quilts folded neatly on chair backs, the small touches that transformed a house into a sanctuary. Sarah's wedding ring still gleamed on Jake's weathered finger, catching the afternoon light that streamed through windows she had once cleaned with loving attention to detail. Sarah had a way with making things comfortable, Jake said, noticing Margaret's appreciative gaze. His voice carried the particular tenderness reserved for memories of the departed. She always said, "A home should welcome folks, make them feel like they belonged somewhere." Margaret nodded, understanding the gift she was being given, not just shelter, but a glimpse into the love story that had shaped this man's character. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was. Jake moved toward the kitchen suddenly, awkward with the domesticity required by his guest's presence. That is, you must be hungry. Doc Patterson said you needed proper food." The kitchen revealed the truth of Jake's bachelor existence since Sarah's death. Dishes sat unwashed in the basin, the pantry held only the most basic staples, and the general air of neglect spoke of a man who had forgotten how to care for himself. In his grief, Margaret watched as Jake stared at the meager supplies with the helpless expression of someone facing an impossible task. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a cook," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Sarah handled most everything, really. I can manage coffee and beans, but that's about the extent of my skills." Margaret moved toward the pantry, her teacher's instincts taking over despite her weakened state. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the supplies. When Jake nodded eagerly, she began taking inventory with the practiced eye of someone who had made do with limited resources for months. "You have flour, some dried meat, a few vegetables that are still good," she observed, her voice gaining strength as she found purpose in the familiar task of making something from nothing. "With a little creativity, we can make a proper meal." As Margaret began preparing food, Jake found himself watching her with fascination. Her movements, though slowed by exhaustion, carried the confidence of someone comfortable in a kitchen. She hummed softly as she worked, an unconscious habit that spoke of happier times when cooking had been an act of love rather than survival. "You don't have to wait on me," Jake protested, uncomfortable with being served by someone he was supposed to be helping. "I want to," Margaret replied simply. "You've shown me more kindness in one day than I've received in months. Let me contribute. Something, even if it's just a meal." The process of cooking together created an unexpected intimacy. Margaret directed while Jake followed her instructions, their conversation flowing naturally as they worked. She learned about his struggles to maintain the ranch alone, about the practical challenges of managing livestock and repairs without Sarah's organizational skills. He learned about her teaching methods, about the satisfaction she had found in watching children discover the joy of learning. "I miss it," Margaret admitted, as she stirred a pot of stew that filled the kitchen with warmth and the promise of sustenance. Not just the teaching, but the feeling of being useful, of making a difference in young lives. Jake set the table, with Sarah's good dishes, a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed. "You made a difference in plenty of lives. Those children you taught, they'll carry what you gave them forever. But what good is that now?" The question escaped before Margaret could stop it, revealing the depth of her despair. "What's the point of all those years if I end up forgotten and discarded?" Jake paused in his table setting, considering her words carefully. "Sarah used to say that kindness was like planting seeds. You might not always see the harvest, but that doesn't mean it isn't growing somewhere." He gestured toward the stew she was preparing. "Look at what you're doing right now. An hour ago, I was staring at a cold kitchen, wondering if I could manage. Another meal of coffee and stale bread. Now this place feels alive again." They sat down to eat as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the kitchen in shades of gold and amber. The stew was simple but nourishing, seasoned with herbs Margaret had found growing wild in Sarah's abandoned garden. For the first time in months, Margaret felt truly satisfied, not just physically, but emotionally. This is the best meal I've had since—" Jake paused, realizing the weight of what he was about to say. "Since before Sarah took ill." Margaret looked around the kitchen, noting the small signs of a man struggling to maintain a life suddenly deprived of its organizing principle. "You loved her very much." 12 years, Jake confirmed. "Met her at a church social when she was visiting her cousin. She was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen, but it was her laugh that got me. Sounded like music." He touched his wedding ring unconsciously. "Sometimes I still listen for it." As they talked, Margaret began to understand the parallel nature of their losses. Jake had lost the woman who gave his life meaning and purpose. She had lost the vocation that defined her identity and worth. Both were struggling to rebuild from the ruins of their former lives, both searching for reasons to hope again. "I should help you with the washing up," Margaret offered as the meal concluded. Jake shook his head firmly. "You should rest. Doc Patterson's orders." He stood and began clearing the table. "The spare room is ready for you. Sarah kept it prepared for visitors, though we didn't get many." Margaret rose slowly, still weak, but feeling more human than she had in weeks. "Jake, I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for the meal and shelter, but for seeing me as a person worth helping when everyone else had written me off." Jake paused in his dish gathering, meeting her eyes with an intensity that spoke of deep conviction. "Anyone who could write you off doesn't know what they're looking at," he said simply. "You're worth helping, Margaret Sullivan. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As Margaret settled into the spare room that night, surrounded by the quiet comfort of clean sheets and solid walls, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. For the first time in months, she wasn't wondering where her next meal would come from or whether she would survive another cold night in the drafty schoolhouse. Instead, she found herself thinking about tomorrow, about the possibility that her story might not be over after all. In the kitchen, Jake stood at the window, washing dishes and thinking about the remarkable woman now sleeping under his roof. Sarah's ring caught the lamplight as he worked, but for the first time since her death, it didn't feel like a weight of guilt, but rather a reminder of the capacity for love that still existed within him. Margaret woke to the unfamiliar luxury of sunlight streaming through clean windows and the distant sound of Jake tending to his morning chores. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the warmth of proper bedding and the absence of the constant worry that had plagued her sleep for months. The spare room, clearly maintained with Sarah's careful attention to detail, felt like a sanctuary. After the harsh reality of the abandoned schoolhouse, rising slowly, mindful of her still recovering strength, Margaret made her way to the kitchen, where she found evidence of Jake's attempt at breakfast: burned coffee, charred bacon, and what appeared to be the remnants of eggs that had fought back. She couldn't help but smile at the scene, recognizing the earnest effort of a man trying to provide hospitality despite his limited culinary skills. "I thought I'd try to have something ready for you," Jake called from outside, having heard her movement through the open window. "But I'm afraid cooking isn't among my talents." Margaret began cleaning up the kitchen disaster, her movements gaining purpose and energy as she worked. "Why don't you tend to your animals?" she suggested through the window. "I'll see what I can salvage from this battlefield." As Jake went about his morning routine, Margaret explored the kitchen more thoroughly, discovering Sarah's handwritten recipe book tucked away in a drawer beneath dishcloths and candle stubs. The pages were filled with neat script detailing everything from simple breakfast preparations to elaborate holiday meals, each recipe annotated with notes about family, preferences, and seasonal variations. The discovery felt like finding buried treasure. Here was a roadmap to creating the kind of domestic comfort that this house had once known, written in the hand of the woman who had understood Jake's needs and preferences. But more than that, it represented an opportunity for Margaret to contribute meaningfully to the household that had offered her refuge. When Jake returned, he found the kitchen transformed. The acrid smell of burned food had been replaced by the inviting aroma of fresh biscuits and properly prepared bacon. Margaret stood at the stove, the recipe book open beside her, looking more like her former confident self than the broken woman he had carried from Henderson's store. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing toward the book. "I found Sarah's recipes and thought, well, it seemed a shame to let such wisdom go unused." Jake's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. "She would have wanted them used," he said finally. "Sarah never could stand to see good things go to waste." As they shared the improved breakfast, their conversation flowed more easily than it had the previous evening. Margaret asked about the ranch operations, genuinely interested in understanding the challenges Jake faced. He, in turn, inquired about her teaching methods, drawing her out about the satisfaction she had found in education. "I used to think teaching was just about facts and figures," Margaret said, spreading honey on a biscuit with careful appreciation. "But after all these years, I realized it was really about helping children discover they were capable of more than they believed possible." "Sounds like you were good at it," Jake observed. "I thought I was." Margaret's voice carried a note of uncertainty that spoke to how deeply her dismissal had shaken her confidence. "But perhaps the school board was right. Perhaps I was outdated, too set in my ways." Jake set down his coffee cup with deliberate firmness. "The school board was wrong about a lot of things. Don't let their bad judgment make you question your worth." After breakfast, Margaret insisted on helping with the household chores, despite Jake's protests that she should rest. They fell into an easy partnership, Margaret organizing and cleaning with the systematic approach of someone accustomed to managing a classroom, while Jake handled the heavier tasks that required physical strength. It was while cleaning Sarah's bedroom that Margaret made another discovery. Hidden in the wardrobe behind winter coats was a collection of children's primers and basic reading books, clearly intended for informal tutoring. Sarah taught some of the younger children to read, Jake explained when Margaret asked about the books. "Nothing formal, just helping out families who couldn't afford proper schooling. She always said education shouldn't be a luxury." "She sounds like she understood what really mattered," Margaret said, running her fingers over the well-worn books with the reverence of someone who had dedicated her life to similar pursuits. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Henderson arrived in her buggy, her expression a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disapproval. Margaret felt her stomach tighten at the sight of the woman who had treated her with such coldness the day before. "Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Henderson called out as Jake emerged from the barn. "I've come to check on Miss Sullivan. There's been talk in town, and I thought it proper to ensure she's recovering appropriately." The emphasis on appropriately carried clear implications about the propriety of Margaret staying unchaperoned at Jake's ranch. Margaret stepped onto the porch, her chin lifted with the dignity that no amount of hardship had been able to diminish. "Mrs. Henderson," she acknowledged coolly, "how thoughtful of you to express concern for my welfare now." If Mrs. Henderson caught the subtle rebuke in Margaret's tone, she chose to ignore it. "The ladies in town are naturally worried about your reputation. Dear, an unmarried woman staying alone with a widower, well, people do talk." Jake's jaw tightened visibly. "Let them talk," he said, his voice carrying a hard edge. "Miss Sullivan is here because she needed help, and any decent person would have offered the same." "I'm not questioning your motives, Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Henderson replied with false sweetness. "I'm simply concerned about appearances. Perhaps it would be better if Margaret returned to her previous arrangements." "You mean the abandoned schoolhouse with no heat or proper shelter?" Margaret's voice remained steady, but Jake could see the pain behind her composed facade. "How considerate of you to worry about my reputation while suggesting I return to circumstances that nearly killed me." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed at the direct challenge to her manufactured concern. "Well, I simply thought you thought you'd come out here to gather gossip for your next tea party," Jake interrupted, his patience finally exhausted. "Margaret is welcome here as long as she wants to stay, and what anyone thinks about it is their business, not mine." After Mrs. Henderson's hasty departure, Margaret and Jake found themselves standing together on the porch, watching her buggy disappear in a cloud of dust and indignation. "I'm sorry you had to endure that," Jake said quietly. "Some people seem to find more pleasure in tearing others down than in building them up." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the confrontation, but its implications for both their futures. "Perhaps she's right about one thing," she said finally. "My being here does put you in a difficult position." Jake turned to face her, his expression intense. "The only thing that would put me in a difficult position is you leaving before you're strong enough to take care of yourself properly." He paused, seeming to wrestle with words he wasn't sure he should speak. "This place has felt more like a home in the past 2 days than it has in the 8 months since Sarah died. Don't let small-minded gossips drive you away from where you belong." The words hung between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. But as they stood together in the fading afternoon light, both felt the undeniable truth that something precious was growing between them, a partnership born of mutual need that was slowly transforming into something deeper and more enduring. The days that followed Mrs. Henderson's visit settled into a rhythm that brought unexpected peace to both Margaret and Jake. They developed routines that honored both their individual strengths and their growing partnership. Margaret rising early to prepare breakfast while Jake tended the animals, shared midday meals where they discussed everything from ranch improvements to books they had read, and evening walks around the property that gradually extended longer as Margaret's strength returned. It was during one of these evening strolls that they discovered the meadow where Sarah had once gathered wildflowers for pressing. The late autumn. Blooms were sparse but determined, small clusters of purple asters and goldenrod that had survived the first frost through sheer persistence. Margaret knelt among them, her teacher's eye naturally cataloguing the different species, while Jake watched with growing appreciation for her quiet intelligence. Sarah used to say that wildflowers were proof that beauty could grow anywhere, even in the hardest ground, Jake said, settling beside her on a fallen log. She pressed them in her Bible, said it was her way of keeping God's artwork close to hand. Margaret nodded, understanding instinctively the significance of this shared confidence. "I used to bring wildflowers to my classroom. The children loved learning their names, drawing pictures of them for their nature journals." She touched one of the purple asters gently. "It's funny how the smallest things can carry such meaning." Their conversations during these walks had grown increasingly personal, moving beyond the polite boundaries of host and guest toward the deeper territory of two people discovering genuine compatibility. Jake found himself sharing stories about his courtship of Sarah, his dreams for the ranch, his fears about facing the coming winter alone. Margaret spoke of her teaching philosophy, her regrets about never marrying or having children of her own, her growing uncertainty about what the future might hold. "I used to think I had my whole life planned out," she confided as they made their way back toward the house, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. "I would teach until I was too old to stand in front of a classroom, maybe write a book about education methods, spend my golden years surrounded by former students who remembered me fondly." "That still sounds possible," Jake suggested carefully, uncertain how to offer hope without seeming presumptuous. Margaret's laugh held no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance of changed circumstances. "Perhaps, but I'm learning that life rarely follows the plans we make for it. Sometimes the detours lead to places we never expected to find." As they reached the porch, Jake found himself studying Margaret's profile in the fading light. The past week had brought color back to her cheeks, and a renewed vitality to her movements. More than that, her presence had begun to fill the empty spaces in his daily life, making him realize how much he had been simply surviving rather than truly living. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Tommy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's 10-year-old son, who arrived on foot with a slate board clutched under his arm and an expression of desperate determination on his young face. "Miss Sullivan," he called out as she emerged from the chicken coop with a basket of eggs. "Ma doesn't know I'm here, but I need help with my reading. The new teacher who comes through town sometimes, she doesn't explain things the way you did." Margaret's face lit up with the particular joy that came from being needed for her true calling. "Tommy, of course I'll help you. What seems to be giving you trouble?" Jake watched from the barn doorway as Margaret settled into teaching mode, her entire demeanor transforming as she focused on the boy's struggles with longer words. She was patient and encouraging, breaking down complex concepts into manageable pieces, celebrating small victories with genuine enthusiasm. This was Margaret Sullivan as she was meant to be, confident, purposeful, invaluable. "You see how the tie-in ending sounds the same in education and creation," she explained, using a stick to write the words in the dirt since they lacked proper paper. "Once you learn that pattern, you can read dozens of new words." Tommy's face brightened as understanding dawned. "Oh, like station and nation." "Exactly." Margaret's smile was radiant. "You're a natural learner, Tommy. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As the impromptu lesson continued, Jake found himself thinking about the waste represented by Margaret's dismissal from her teaching position. Here was a woman with a genuine gift for education, someone who could unlock potential in young minds, being forced to live in poverty while children struggled without proper instruction. The lesson was interrupted by the arrival of another child, Susan Miller, daughter of a local farmer, who had apparently heard about Tommy's visit and decided to brave her parents' potential disapproval to seek help with her arithmetic. Soon after, young David Patterson, the doctor's grandson, appeared with questions about geography. "Word travels fast among children," Margaret observed to Jake as she organized her impromptu outdoor classroom. "They remember who helped them learn, even when the adults prefer to forget." Jake felt a surge of pride watching Margaret work with the children. Her natural authority commanded their attention without fear. Her explanations made difficult concepts accessible, and her genuine care for their progress was evident in every interaction. This was teaching as it should be, personal, patient, and focused on the individual needs of each student. "Miss Sullivan," Susan asked during a break between arithmetic problems, "why aren't you our teacher anymore?" "Ma says it's because the town couldn't afford to pay you, but Pa says it's because Mayor Caldwell wanted his cousin to get the job." Margaret's expression grew carefully neutral, but Jake caught the flash of pain that crossed her features. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions for reasons that don't have much to do with what's best for children," she answered diplomatically. "What matters is that you keep learning, wherever and however you can." As the informal school session concluded, and the children departed with homework assignments scratched on their slates, Jake approached Margaret with a question that had been forming in his mind all afternoon. "What would you think about making this a regular thing?" he asked. "The children clearly need proper instruction, and you obviously miss teaching. Maybe we could fix up that old shed, make it into a proper schoolroom." Margaret's eyes widened at the suggestion. "Jake, that's generous, but I couldn't ask you to—" "You're not asking," he interrupted gently. "I'm offering. This ranch could use the sound of children's voices, and this community needs someone who remembers that education is about more than just saving money." As they stood together in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the evidence of Margaret's impromptu teaching session, both felt the stirring of something that went beyond mere attraction or convenience. They were beginning to envision a shared future, a partnership that would allow each to contribute their best gifts to something larger than themselves. That night, as Margaret pressed the wildflowers they had gathered into the pages of her father's Bible, she felt a sense of purpose returning that she had thought lost forever. The flowers would dry between the sacred pages, preserving their beauty, just as this unexpected sanctuary was preserving and restoring her faith in the possibility of new beginnings. The November air carried the crisp promise of winter as Margaret accompanied Jake on his evening ritual for the first time. She had known about his daily visits to Sarah's grave, but had respected the privacy of his grief, understanding that some sorrows required solitude. But tonight, when he quietly asked if she would like to come along, she recognized the invitation as a significant step in their growing trust. The small cemetery sat on a gentle rise overlooking the valley, its modest collection of headstones, bearing witness to the dreams and struggles of Millbrook's pioneers. Sarah's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross that Jake had carved himself, its clean lines and careful proportions speaking to both his skill as a craftsman and the depth of his devotion. As they approached the gravesite, Jake's usual, confident stride faltered, and Margaret saw the weight of accumulated grief settle over his shoulders like a familiar burden. He knelt beside the cross, his weathered hands trembling as he touched the carved wood that bore his wife's name and the dates that bracketed her too brief life. "I don't know how to do this, Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking with 8 months of suppressed anguish. "I don't know how to keep going without you, how to make decisions, how to—" His words dissolved into the kind of raw sobbing that comes when grief finally finds its voice. Margaret knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as he wept for the woman who had been his anchor, his joy, his reason for believing. In tomorrow, she said nothing, understanding that this moment required presence rather than words, witness rather than comfort. "She was everything good in my life," Jake managed when the initial storm of emotion passed. "She made me better than I was, made me want to be worthy of her love, and now she's gone. And I can't figure out how to honor what she gave me." "Tell me about her," Margaret said softly. "Help me understand the woman who shaped the man I've come to care about." Jake's voice steadied as he began to share memories. Sarah's laugh that could brighten the darkest day, her insistence on planting flowers in impossible places, her way of seeing potential in everyone she met. He spoke of their courtship, their quiet wedding, their shared dreams of children and prosperity that had never quite materialized, but had never dimmed their happiness in each other. "She wanted to help with the school," Jake revealed, gesturing toward the hand-carved cross. "Not as a teacher like you, but supporting families who couldn't afford books or supplies. She was always gathering things for children who needed them." He paused, seeming to wrestle with a confession. "I think she would have liked you, Margaret. You have the same kind of heart." Margaret felt tears gathering in her own eyes, moved, not just by Jake's pain, but by his generous inclusion of her in his sacred memories. "I wish I could have known her," she said honestly, "but I can see her influence in everything you do, every kindness you show. She's still with you, Jake. Love like that doesn't disappear just because the person is gone. Then why does it hurt? So much to think about moving forward?" The question emerged like a plea, revealing the guilt that had been eating at Jake's heart. "Sometimes I catch myself laughing at something you've said, or looking forward to our evening walks, and then I feel like I'm betraying her memory." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "When I lost my teaching position, I thought my life was over. Everything I had worked for, everything that gave my existence meaning, was suddenly gone. I felt like I was betraying my own father's memory. He was a teacher too, you know, by failing to live up to the legacy he left me." Jake looked at her, seeing a parallel grief he hadn't recognized before. "But being here with you has taught me something," Margaret continued. "Honoring someone's memory doesn't mean stopping our own lives. It means carrying forward the best of what they gave us." She gestured toward the cross he had carved. "You made this with your own hands, with the same care and attention you brought to loving Sarah. That's not betrayal, that's the highest form of tribute." As if summoned by their conversation, a flight of wild geese passed overhead, their calls echoing across the valley as they made their way south for the winter. Jake and Margaret watched them disappear into the twilight, both understanding the symbolism of migration, of following instincts towards survival and renewal. "I've been coming here every evening since she died," Jake admitted. "Talking to her, asking her what I should do, waiting for some kind of sign." He touched the cross again, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. But maybe the sign isn't going to come from talking to the past. Maybe it comes from having the courage to embrace the present. Margaret felt her heart quicken at the implication of his words, but she forced herself to proceed carefully. They were both vulnerable people who had suffered significant losses. Any commitment between them needed to be built on solid ground rather than mutual need alone. "Faith is a complicated thing," she said, thinking of her own struggles with belief since her world had collapsed. "I used to think it meant having all the answers, knowing exactly what God wanted from me. But I'm beginning to understand that sometimes faith means admitting you don't know what comes next and choosing to keep walking anyway." Jake stood slowly, offering his hand to help Margaret rise. As she accepted his assistance, their fingers intertwined naturally, and neither moved to break the connection as they stood together in the gathering darkness. "I haven't been to church since the funeral," Jake confessed. "Couldn't stand the sympathy, couldn't bear hearing about God's plan when his plan seemed so cruel." "I stopped going too," Margaret admitted. "When the community I served turned away from me, it felt like God had turned away as well." She squeezed his hand gently. "But maybe we've been looking for faith in the wrong places. Maybe it's not in buildings or ceremonies, but in moments like this, in the courage to help a stranger, in the willingness to trust again." As they made their way back toward the house, Jake realized something had shifted during their time at Sarah's grave. The daily visits had been about holding on to the past, but tonight felt like the beginning of something different. A way of carrying Sarah's memory forward while opening his heart to new possibilities. For the first time since her death, Jake didn't feel guilty about the warmth he felt walking beside Margaret, didn't question whether caring for another woman diminished what he had shared with his wife. Love, he was beginning to understand, didn't have finite boundaries. It could expand to encompass new relationships without diminishing old ones, could honor the past while embracing the future. That night, as Margaret updated her father's Bible with the wildflowers they had gathered. Earlier, she noticed that Jake didn't immediately retreat to his solitary evening routine. Instead, he lingered in the kitchen, clearly wanting to continue their conversation, but uncertain how to proceed. "Would you like some tea?" Margaret offered, recognizing his need for continued connection without pressuring him to define it. "I'd like that," Jake replied, settling into the chair that had become his customary spot during their evening talks. "I'd like that very much." The December morning arrived with an unexpected visitor who would change everything, Margaret thought. She knew about her circumstances. Ezra Williams rode up to Jake's ranch in a well-maintained buggy, his formal city clothes and leather satchel marking him as distinctly out of place in the rough frontier setting. Margaret watched through the kitchen window as Jake emerged from the barn to greet the stranger, their conversation too distant to overhear, but animated enough to suggest importance. Williams was a man in his 50s, with the careful bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with legal complexities and the measured speech of a professional who understood the weight of words. When Jake brought him to the house, Margaret noticed immediately that the visitor's attention focused on her with an intensity that seemed to suggest recognition. "Miss Margaret Sullivan?" Williams inquired, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "Daughter of Edmund Sullivan, formerly of Kansas City." Margaret's breath caught at the mention of her father's name. Edmund Sullivan had been dead for nearly 20 years, and she rarely heard him referenced by anyone in Millbrook who had known him during his brief time as the town's first formal educator. "Yes, that's correct," she replied carefully, gesturing for the men to join her at the kitchen table. "Though I'm afraid I don't understand what business you might have with me regarding my father." Williams opened his satchel and withdrew a collection of legal documents that he arranged with methodical precision on the scrubbed wooden surface. "I represent the law firm of Williams, Crawford and Associates from Denver. We've been attempting to locate you for some time regarding matters pertaining to your father's estate." "My father's estate?" Margaret's voice carried confusion rather than hope. "Mr. Williams, My father died nearly penniless. He left me his Bible, his teaching materials, and a few personal effects. There was no estate to speak of. Williams studied her with the expression of someone delivering news that would require careful explanation. Miss Sullivan, I'm afraid you've been operating under a significant misunderstanding. Your father owned considerable property and mineral rights in this territory, holdings that have been generating substantial income for the past 2 decades. The words seemed to hang in the air like something foreign and incomprehensible. Margaret looked at Jake, whose expression reflected her own bewilderment, then back at the lawyer who was arranging documents with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing information. That's impossible, Margaret said flatly. My father was a teacher. He lived modestly, saved what little he could. When he died, I inherited nothing of value except his personal belongings. Williams withdrew a deed from his collection of papers, its official seals and elaborate script speaking to its legal significance. This document shows that Edmund Sullivan purchased mineral rights to 300 acres of land in this county, including the property where the current schoolhouse sits, and extends eastward to include portions of what is now the town center. Margaret stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. The legal terminology was complex, but certain phrases stood out clearly. Mineral extraction rights, quarterly payments, significant financial holdings. According to these papers, she was not a penniless former teacher, but a woman of considerable means. I don't understand, she whispered. If this is true, why wasn't I informed? Why have I been living in poverty when supposedly I own valuable property? Williams's expression darkened as he reached for another set of documents. That, Miss Sullivan, brings us to the more troubling aspect of this matter. It appears that certain individuals in positions of authority have been intercepting the payments intended for you and falsifying documents to suggest that your father died intestate, without a will or significant assets. Jake leaned forward, his voice tight, with growing anger. Are you saying someone has been stealing from Margaret for 20 years? Not just stealing, Williams corrected grimly, conducting an elaborate fraud designed to keep Miss Sullivan unaware of her inheritance while systematically embezzling funds that legally belonged to her. He spread out additional papers showing financial records, forged signatures, and correspondence that painted a picture of deliberate deception. Margaret's hands trembled as she examined the evidence. Bank statements showed regular deposits being made into accounts she had never known existed. Letters bearing forged signatures authorized transactions she had never approved. Most damning of all were communications between Mayor Caldwell and certain school board members discussing the need to maintain the current arrangement regarding the Sullivan estate. Mayor Caldwell, Margaret breathed, the pieces finally beginning to form a coherent picture. He's been behind this. Williams nodded gravely. Mayor Caldwell, along with several members of the school board and at least one bank official, have been systematically defrauding you of your inheritance. The dismissal from your teaching position appears to have been motivated by fear that your growing financial desperation might lead you to investigate your father's estate more thoroughly. Jake's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, his face flushed with rage. They've been stealing from her while watching her starve. They dismissed her from her job, let her become homeless, let the whole town treat her like a burden, all while they were getting rich off money that belonged to her. The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. Margaret thought of the months of hunger, the nights in the cold schoolhouse, the humiliation of begging for charity from people who were secretly profiting from her inheritance. The faded photograph tucked in her Bible took on new significance, not just a memento of lost happiness, but evidence of a life deliberately destroyed by people she had trusted. How much? Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. How much money are we talking about? Williams consulted his documents carefully. Including accumulated interest and penalties, the amount stolen exceeds $15,000. Your current legitimate holdings, including the mineral rights and property, are worth considerably more. The sum was beyond Margaret's comprehension. $15,000 represented more money than most people in Millbrook would see in several lifetimes. It was enough to ensure comfort and security for the rest of her days, enough to establish the kind of school she had always dreamed of creating, enough to transform not just her own life, but the educational opportunities available to every child in the territory. But even as the financial implications sank in, Margaret found herself grappling with more complex emotions. The poverty that had brought her to Jake's ranch, the desperation that had led to their growing closeness, all of it had been built on lies and theft. Would Jake still want her in his life now that she was a woman of means rather than someone who needed his protection? There's more, Williams continued, seemingly unaware of the emotional turmoil his revelations were causing. We have evidence that suggests your dismissal from the teaching position was specifically timed to prevent you from establishing the kind of community connections that might have led to questions about your father's legacy. Mayor Caldwell was apparently concerned that your growing influence might eventually lead someone to examine the discrepancies in the estate records. Jake sat back down heavily, running his hands through his hair as he processed the scope of the conspiracy. So they didn't just steal her money, they destroyed her reputation, her career, her standing in the community, all to cover up their theft. It appears so, Williams confirmed. This was not a crime of opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated plan to ensure Miss Sullivan remained isolated and financially dependent, unable to pursue the resources that would have exposed the fraud. Margaret stared at the documents spread across her kitchen table, legal papers that proved she was wealthy, evidence that revealed the extent of the betrayal, proof that her suffering had been deliberately orchestrated by people she had trusted. The hand-carved wooden desk that now sat gathering dust in Henderson's storage shed had been paid for with her own money. Money stolen by the very people who had claimed the town could no longer afford her services. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Williams began gathering the papers with professional efficiency. "Now, Miss Sullivan, we pursue justice, we recover your stolen funds, we expose the criminals responsible, and we ensure that you receive every penny that is rightfully yours." He paused, studying her carefully. "But I should warn you, pursuing this case will require you to confront some very powerful people in this community. It won't be easy, and it won't be pleasant." Margaret looked at Jake, seeing in his eyes the same determination that was building in her own heart. For months, she had accepted her circumstances as unfortunate but inevitable. Now she understood that her suffering had been deliberately inflicted by people who had enriched themselves at her expense while watching her slowly starve. "Mr. Williams," she said with quiet conviction, "I want justice, not just for myself, but for every person in this community who trusted these men to act with integrity. If they could do this to me, how many others have they cheated?" As Williams prepared to leave, promising to return with additional evidence and legal proceedings, Margaret found herself transformed yet again. No longer the desperate woman who had collapsed from hunger, no longer even the grateful guest who had found refuge in Jake's kindness. She was now a woman with the means to fight back, to demand accountability, and to ensure that the truth would finally see the light of day. But as she watched Jake's expression during Williams's departure, she wondered if this revelation of her true circumstances would prove to be a blessing or a curse for the relationship that had become the most precious thing in her life. The days following Ezra Williams' revelation passed in a whirlwind of preparation and emotional upheaval. Word had been sent throughout the territory that a special town meeting would be held to address matters of urgent community concern. Though the specific nature of those matters remained carefully guarded, Margaret found herself oscillating between righteous anger at the injustices committed against her and deep anxiety about how the coming confrontation would affect her relationship with Jake and her place in the community. Williams had returned with additional evidence that painted an even more damning picture of the conspiracy against her. Bank records showed a sophisticated network of fraudulent transactions. Forged documents bore the signatures of respected community leaders, and correspondence revealed the calculated nature of the plot to keep Margaret isolated and impoverished. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity and heartbreaking in its cruelty, but perhaps the most emotionally significant discovery came when Margaret was finally able to retrieve her personal belongings from the various places they had been stored or abandoned. Among her father's effects, carefully preserved in a trunk she had been forced to leave behind when evicted from her cottage, she found her mother's silver locket, a delicate piece of jewelry she had thought lost forever. The locket contained tiny photographs of her parents in their youth, images that spoke of hope and dreams that had been partially fulfilled through Margaret's own dedication to education. Her mother, who had died when Margaret was still a child, smiled from the faded daguerreotype with the same gentle expression that Margaret remembered from her earliest years. Her father, serious and dignified in his formal portrait, looked like the teacher and scholar he had been, a man who had valued knowledge above material wealth, but who had also been wise enough to invest in his daughter's future security. "She was beautiful," Jake observed, studying the photographs over Margaret's shoulder as she sat at the kitchen table examining her recovered treasures. "I can see where you get your strength." Margaret traced the outline of her mother's face. With a fingertip, worn smooth by years of handling chalk and pencils. "I used to wear this locket every day when I was teaching. It reminded me that I was part of something larger than myself, part of a tradition of learning and growth." She closed the locket carefully, its soft click marking the restoration of another piece of her former identity. The emotional weight of reclaiming her possessions was complicated by Jake's increasingly visible struggle with the implications of her transformed circumstances. Margaret watched him wrestle with feelings he couldn't quite articulate. Pride in her strength and determination, anger at the injustices she had suffered, but also a growing fear that her wealth would create an insurmountable barrier between them. "You don't have to stay here anymore," he said quietly one evening as they sat by the fire, his words carrying the weight of resignation rather than suggestion. "You can afford your own place now, probably something much finer than anything I could offer." Margaret set down the book she had been reading, one of the primers from her recovered teaching materials, and studied Jake's profile in the firelight. His jaw was set with the determined stoicism of a man preparing himself for loss. His hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if holding himself together through sheer force of will. "Is that what you want?" she asked carefully. "For me to leave?" Jake's silence stretched long enough to reveal the depth of his internal conflict. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the raw honesty of a man who had learned that life offered no guarantees of happiness. "What I want and what makes sense aren't the same thing," he admitted. "You're an educated woman with means now. You could establish your own school, travel, see parts of the world you've only read about in books. Why would you want to tie yourself to a struggling rancher who can barely read beyond a primer level?" Margaret felt her heart break a little at the vulnerability hidden beneath his practical words. Here was a man who had shown her kindness when no one else would, who had offered her shelter and dignity when the world had stripped both away, yet he still doubted his own worth in the face of her restored circumstances.